Hello, everyone. Welcome to Change with Emily Barocas. She's the podcast lead at NPR One. We're so excited to have her here today. It's going to be a great discussion about all the capabilities that NPR One has to be supporting independent podcasts and the makers who make them who are here today. So thank you for joining, everyone. And as you know, this is an exclusive AIRstream for Airsters only. This is a perk that you guys get as part of your membership, but we will have the recording available on YouTube right afterwards. It should take about a half an hour. So if you have friends who want to see it afterwards and weren't able to make it live, you can definitely spread the word and send them the video afterwards. But you guys get to ask the live questions. So if you have any questions, please just throw them into the chat on the right, or you can, at the bottom of your screen, ask a question where it says ask a question. And then we'll be feeding questions to Emily as she goes through the presentation. So let me just go through a little bit about our schedule for the next hour. We'll do a little intro and welcome to Emily, and then we'll be talking about NPR One and how it works, like the algorithms, what sort of data Emily uses to make her recommendations, and then the impact it'll have with creators and independents, sort of beyond the podcast library of how you get your show on NPR One, but actually going into the curation and the algorithms and the data behind it. So on that note, I'm going to throw up the presentation and let me just share my screen here and we'll take it away. And Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I think you basically said it all. I'm Emily Barocas. I work on NPR One, which is NPR's mobile platform. We like to think of it sort of as Pandora for radio. And it's just a great and very different interface for podcast content. A little bit of my background, I worked in public radio on Morning Edition for a number of years, went to work on Capitol Hill in communications, and am now back in public media working for NPR One, which I think is a great combination of experience working in journalism and audio, but also bringing in some of the strategy and data analysis that I learned in the other part of my career. So that's a little bit about me. I'm very excited about NPR One and get you and hopefully start some meaningful dialogues and get some of your content up on NPR One. So we want to go slide. Yes, podcast promotion in NPR One. So NPR One is very most other podcast apps for a number of reasons. One is the ease of use. So there's really no technological barriers to starting to listen to podcasts in NPR One. Our goal is to make it as easy as turning on the radio and for listeners to have access to podcasts there. What that means is that a lot of our audience is not as familiar with podcasts. They're not as deep in the podcast listening space, but they're people that we're trying to bring into the podcast, introduced to it. The second way that it is different is our curation. We do a lot of hand curation, selecting, sorry, my computer's going crazy for a minute, but so we do a lot of hand curation of content. We do a lot of watching data and trying the best content. The third thing is personalization. We have algorithms running in the background that are always trying to get our listeners what the algorithms judge will be their best listening experience. And it makes judgments based on the way they act and what they do in the app they get in the future. And then obviously NPR One is the only place that you'll find NPR newscasts and news magazine content alongside podcasts from NPR, from our member stations, and from third-party podcast producers. And that includes, some of the biggest podcast networks as well as smaller independent productions. All right, next slide. So this slide is about sort of the growing importance of podcasts in the NPR One content mix. Podcasts came into NPR One after content was already established, and you can see that listening to podcasts is over time on our space. It accounts for half of listening minutes in NPR One, over half of the listening minutes. So it's definitely an important part of our content mix. Next slide. Okay, so this is getting more into the nitty gritty of how NPR One works and where listeners find podcasts. The first thing is the news flow. So when a listener turns on NPR One, they get their national newscast, they get their local newscast, and then they'll get an assortment of national and local news magazine content that we've curated for them. Mixed in with that, we will feed them. It sounds like the audio is garbled. Does that mean nobody can hear what I'm saying?
Let me check. I'm going to put my sound on mute. That might help.
It's fine for some people. Okay. I'll keep going and hopefully it normalizes. So news flow, we put podcasts in ways. One we call our special featured collection, and that's putting a podcast into a listener's news flow with no opt-in. So they're just getting what we suggest to them. The second way is a tap through promo, which sounds like your typical podcast promotion, but it says at the end, tap your screen now to hear more, and listeners tap and are taken directly. The other place our listeners find podcasts are we like to highlight new and noteworthy returning shows in that space, as well as a selection of the best from our member stations and from third-party podcast producers. And we also include recommended episodes in that section, which is a great way for us to promote specific episodes of shows. Listeners can also search for anything that's in our podcast library, and we share podcasts in different ways. We've started to experiment with targeted emails, trying to suggest podcast episodes to listeners of another show. And we can talk a little bit more about all of these different promotional tools. But first, I kind of want to explain the underlying algorithm of NPR One podcast listening and how it works. The premise is listening to what our audience likes and giving them more of it. What that means is if our listeners encounter a particular podcast episode and they have a positive experience, and we're judging that by how long they listened and how they engaged with that podcast, then we will implicitly subscribe them to that show, which means they'll get more subsequent episodes of the podcast. So we kind of think of it as being a sticky algorithm. If someone likes what they're hearing, they'll get more of it. Next slide. So going back to how listeners encounter podcasts, the special featured collection is one of the biggest ways that we introduce our listeners to podcast content that we think is particularly great. These are the episodes that just come up in listeners' news flows. They're not opting into them. There's no additional introduction to them other than maybe to say if it's an outside podcast that NPR didn't produce the podcast. And what we look for here is obviously to feature the best of the best content. What our algorithm allows us to do is to a single episode of a show and then see a significant bump in listening to future episodes. So when we're going to promote an episode in our special featured collection or any other collection, we want to pick the best possible example of that podcast's work so that it leads to more future listening. The special featured collection is sort of our largest sort of hammer. Like it's going to get your content out to tens of thousands of listeners. We want it to be the absolute best example of your work possible. And generally what we look for are podcasts that are relatively general interest, somewhat evergreen, so that they're going to appeal to a large mass of our listeners. We look for content to be about 18 to 35 minutes long. When it gets past 35 minutes long, we find that it's very hard for podcasts to retain audience beyond 35 minutes long. And that impacts what percent of listeners will then get the show again in the future. And most importantly, we look for content that has a really strong first 5 minutes. So we want something that's going to immediately engage our listeners, that's going to introduce them to the podcast and the host and the episode and explains really what the episode is about, but also leave space for some sort of narrative intrigue or something to keep you listening. The first 5 minutes in this space are particularly important. One is that because our listeners are not opting in here, we don't want them to have this sort of what the heck am I listening to moment. We want them to get pretty quickly oriented to what they're hearing and why they're hearing it. Second is that we know that most skipping of podcasts happens in those first 5 minutes. So if an episode can retain listeners at that time, it's likely to retain listeners for a longer period. All right.
Emily, on that question,
yes.
Are these trends that you've seen generally in the podcasting industry, people listening across different platforms, or are these really learnings that we should take about NPR One specifically?
Our studies have obviously been particularly relevant to on our platform, but I think generally there's some good lessons that could apply on any platform. I think at any platform, the value of the first few minutes is going to be. I think it also not just because there's so much content vying for listeners' attention. 35 minutes kind of being the cutoff for retaining a good percent of the audience. That said, it's more important on our platform because of our algorithm than maybe on some other platforms. But I think, as podcast producers are starting to get access to Apple Analytics and analytics from other places, I have a feeling they'll start to see a lot of the same trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, and there was actually a Wired article that just came out a couple days ago about how the podcast listeners really are those holy grail listeners for advertisers that everyone hoped they would be. So I would recommend everyone check out that article if you haven't read it yet from Wired. It gives a good insight into how people are using these analytics from Apple. But yeah, let's continue.
Yes, and we can talk more about Apple Analytics as we get to the next section, which I believe let's move over. When we talk about our recommended section, we get into a little bit more about the importance of titles, which I think also plays really well into the Apple Analytics. So this is just a little bit more about those first 5 minutes and what we look for in that space. We want to know what's this episode about. We want to be held in a little bit of suspense, kind of getting at the idea of narrative suspense. I really want to get a sense of the show quickly. What's the personality of the show? Who is driving the show? What is the statement of purpose? The note at the bottom, pre-roll versus no pre-roll. We've started to see really no impact of having a pre-roll in a show in terms of skipping. I think listeners are getting used to hearing it and are getting accustomed to it. So, if it's one pre-roll that's under 30 seconds long, I think you're safe. I think if you start filling up the top of your show with, a pre-roll and then Patreon and then some other business from the previous week and it's going on and on, you start to lose listeners at that point. Okay. This is a graph that shows, this is basically a listening curve. This is what we very often look at when we're making analysis about this. It's basically showing listeners are still looking at different time durations across the length of the podcast. So what you can see is pretty typical at the top. The beginning is where you're to lose listeners. But if you can retain those listeners at the top, you're pretty likely to end up in a better place than if you didn't. The other thing you can see here with the pink line is the importance of length and just what a difference it makes when your show is 23 minutes long and you've got 40% of your listeners still with you versus 52 minutes long and you've got, 30% of your listeners. The other thing this shows that I think is really interesting, what that arrow is pointing to is a spot in the show where they switch topics. So these are episodes of Pop Culture Happy Hour, an NPR show about movies and TV and music and all sorts of things. And that purple line is an episode that started off talking about Star Wars, and you can see right there just a huge drop off in listens. So it's just an important production note to keep in mind. If you're going to make a big turn in your show, you may want to think about separating it out into 2 episodes, or just doing, making sure that the 2 topics that you're talking about are going to be more aligned in terms of audience interest so that you retain that audience.
We had a listener question about what about shorter than 18 minutes? Looking at this graph, you can see that you would conjecture that before 18 minutes, if it was even shorter, that might be even more listener retention. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yes. So, we're starting to see more and more shorter podcasts, I would say, in the last year or so. And so the 18 to 35 minute is sort of the sweet spot that we found at a certain point. But now I do think there's room for shorter podcasts. The indicator that NPR is now doing with from Planet Money, which is like a 6 or 7, and they have, percent of the audience left at the end of each show. And, other podcasts that are certainly finding a nice niche in the 12-minute space. That certainly works really well as well.
Great. We have a question from Steve. He's asking, I know some definitions of pre-roll, but not 100% sure what you mean.
So pre-roll would just be like an ad or an underwriting credit at the top of the show.
Right.
Something that comes before your content starts.
Great.
Cool. All right. This is talking about the recommended collection. So this is the podcast episode recommendations that live on the Explore page of the app. Like the special featured section, we're looking for these to be amazing episodes, the best of your content. But in this case, our listeners are actually opting in to hear your show. So we're looking for, again, on the shorter side, 18 to 35 minutes long, but the really key piece here is a title that clearly explains what the episode is about. So what we find is like cute, catchy titles don't always work that well in this space, but a title that is just really straightforward and engages the listener works much better in this space. And this is when I was talking about Apple Analytics before, this is what I was getting at, that I think as people start to see Apple Analytics and see which episodes of their shows listeners are actually clicking to listen to, I think more and more people are going to start to understand the importance of your episode title, and that this is really your sales pitch to your listeners, that it shouldn't be sort of a throwaway last thing about, but this is your way of convincing your listeners to tap and listen to your show. So make every character count, because there's only a limited amount of space for what's going to be displayed, and really think about, how am I going to catch my listeners' eye as they're scrolling through, either all of the episodes that they've downloaded because they're subscribed to it, or that they're seeing in the recommended collection in NPR One, or finding through search, or whatever. However they're encountering your content, you want your title to engage them. All right, next slide. All right, this gets a little more specific about the titles. So tell me what your episode is about and then live up to it. We're really cautious of sort of clickbaity titles. We don't want a title that sounds really appealing, but then you tap through and what you get is totally doesn't relate to what you thought you were getting. We want something clever, but not too clever. We want it to evoke an emotional response. And like I was saying, don't waste too much space with guest names, episode numbers, dates. What we find with guest names is that unless it's a super household name that everyone's just going to love, it just never really gets a listener to click through. You have to be such a super fan of somebody that even like celebrity names don't necessarily encourage people to tap to listen to an episode. So along the side, I've got some examples of podcast titles that worked really well in our recommended collection. Where does creativity come from? Born This Gay, Why Is My Life So Hard? All of those are, you can tell from the title what you're going to get in the episode, and they resonated really well with listeners. You can imagine somebody kind of scrolling through, seeing a title, Why Is My Life So Hard? And saying, yeah, why is my life so hard? And then tapping through to listen. So that worked well.
Great. We have a question about differences between titles on NPR One versus Apple Podcasts. I know when you put your secure feed out there, it's sort of like generalized across all of the podcatchers. And so in this case, would you want to keep your title uniform across the board?
Yeah. So generally, yes. Like, what your title is going to be in one place is what it's going to be anywhere. I believe our not sure that's the right number, but I think the same principles apply to any platform. The one thing I will say is that we are able to go into our backend system and make adjustments to to titles. I don't do it very often, and I would never do it without consulting with the producer before I do it. But if there's an episode that I think would be just perfect in the recommended space, except, we need to take out a couple of words to make it, fit, or there's like a small adjustment that I think would make it work better, sometimes I will get in touch and get permission to make that change.
Cool. And does this apply to both episode titles and show titles?
I can't change show titles, but I can change episode titles.
Okay, great. I have another question about music licensing, but let's save that to the end.
Okay, cool.
Great.
Here's another graph showing the importance of length, I think a little bit more clearly, but you can really see here that when we've got an episode that's about 19 minutes long, 5% of its listeners retain to the end. And then when we get to something that's more like 50 minutes long, you've got a pretty significant drop off there. So just kind of reiterates the importance of length.
Super interesting. Okay, next one.
All right, now we're reaching the end. So this is probably what you guys are all interested in. How do I get my podcast included on NPR One? So what you'll want to do is email me. You can see my email address up there. We do need secure RSS feeds. So they have to have HTTPS at the front, and then the audio enclosure also has to be secure. So the easiest way to check this is if you just put your RSS feed into a browser, search for the term enclosure, and you'll see your sort of audio enclosure come up. That should also have an HTTPS prefix. And if you could send me a couple of examples of what I like to call seed episodes, these are your sort of best of the best that you think would fit with the criteria that I've talked about in terms of promotion, that would be great. So give me, a few examples of episodes that you think I should listen to. We'll say about being included in NPR One is that the bar is basically, do we think this podcast has some value to an audience? It's not a super, super duper high bar. Obviously, we want stuff that has good audio quality. We want content that, doesn't feel completely frivolous, that has some value. The next bar, of course, is getting your show actually promoted in NPR One, which is really what brings listeners to the show. And that brings back all of the criteria that I talked about earlier. What we've seen in our curation over the last year is that, we have done really well with all different kinds of podcasts of all different topics, as long as they fit the criteria of for our promoted category collections. We also love to promote independent content because we've seen a lot of instances where we can promote something small that really feels like a gem, and it makes a really big difference for that podcast in terms of download numbers, and it does that over the long term. So we have opportunities to really promote something we can really get behind. And with that, I will take more questions.
Awesome. I'm going to unshare my screen so that we can just talk face to face. Okay, great. So I have a ton of questions for you. Let's start with questions about episode descriptions. Are episode descriptions seen by the audience in NPR One in the app, and do they have as much importance?
They are seen, because listeners can tap on the episode and see the description. I think that's a good question. I don't really know how important they are. I think they are not as important as title, because listeners have to take that extra step to see them. Inevitably, you can't assume that listeners will tap to see them. If the title doesn't immediately engage them, I think that, they're not likely to take the next step to actually read the description. But, if there's important information to include, then by all means.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And then just in terms of length, we have a ton of questions about length. So I know you mentioned 18 to 35 minutes is the sweet spot, and that we have seen more trends of shorter podcasts. What about, is there a specific disadvantage you can see to having an hour-long podcast or more?
Well, you're not going to have as many listeners with you for the long haul. So, if you're a show that has advertisers, as some of the data becomes more transparent, you may have a harder time attracting advertisers for later in your show, because they're going to know that you don't have a lot of listeners left at that point in the show. I think that we don't have concrete data on this yet, but I think there's also a certain amount of self-selecting among listeners. So if they see the length of a show is an hour or an hour and a half, they may be less likely to listen to it than if it was 30 minutes long, because they don't have the time to get through all of it. So those are just considerations. Obviously, here's what I'll say about length. I think that there's a tendency in the podcast space, because we're not stuck on broadcast clocks, to think, well, okay, great, I can go on and make this an hour-long thing. And I would just really suggest that if you're going to do that, you make sure that every minute is worth the listener's time, because even though there is no broadcast clock, there's still, a matter of having respect for your listeners' time and thinking about, is this something that needs an hour, or is it going to be better at 30? There we go. Is that better?
Yep, sorry. Yeah, so got you back. Sorry, you dropped out for a second. So we were talking about the hour-long.
So just, encouraging everyone to think about whether something really needs to be an hour, if it's better at an hour, or if it's better at a tight, well-edited 30 minutes.
Great. Cool. So people are just asking if she's back. Okay, yeah. Just making sure. Sorry for the technical difficulties, guys. Apologies. So about mid-roll ads, you mentioned pre-roll, but folks are curious about having mid-roll ads too. Do you see a drop-off, or just wondering about it, if it's okay if episodes have mid-roll ads as well? Would those be removed?
I think mid-roll ads are fine. We don't see a lot of drop-off around mid-roll ads. Like I said, I think listeners are used to ads at this point. And unless they're kind of like on the fence about whether they want to stick with it or not, that doesn't seem to have a big impact.
Okay, awesome. Moving right along. Also, just to remind you guys, if you want to ask a question, you can either drop something into the chat box on the right, or you can ask a question at the bottom of the screen where we'll tally up the polls. So what if you, for example, have a series instead of an episodic podcast? Would NPR One ever consider hosting the whole series? Is that something you've done in the past?
So in terms of having it on the site in our podcast library, certainly. In terms of promotion, we would probably just look at promoting the first episode. If it's something that, isn't going to make sense to a listener, if they come in the middle or in the third episode, then we'll look at whether or not the first episode is viable for promotion.
Okay, cool. So you really want to hook people at the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And then one more question about descriptions here. Do episodes need to feature images representing the topic? How does your app surface those images?
No, I'm trying to think, for images for episodes, I don't think we really utilize those that much. What's more important is the art for the show.
Okay.
The icon for the show.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Great. So let's move a little bit into the types of podcasts that people can submit. There are some people asking questions about they're either at small stations or they're public media or they're at just a news outlet. Who can be included on NPR One?
So pretty much anybody. There are different ways that different kinds of shows get into NPR One. So if you're with a member station that's active, in NPR One, you actually have the ability to put your show into NPR One through Station Connect. And if you don't know how to do that, or you don't have anyone at your station that knows how to do that, feel free to reach out and we'll give you the instructions on how to do that. And also, our member stations have the ability to select up to 3 of their podcasts that they want featured for their local audience. So one of the things the app does is it geolocates our listeners and assigns them to their local station. So it knows which newscasts and local news content to provide. In addition, if the member station stars a couple of podcasts, as new episodes of those shows come out, they'll be more prominently featured and fed to their local listeners.
Awesome.
They do have some ability to do some of the curation on their own.
Okay, great. What if you're just you work at a magazine, or you have some other content that's not public media affiliated, or you're not sort of like labeled as independent? What would be the process for that?
Still just email me, and we can talk about which of your shows make sense in NPR One and start the process of bringing them in. If it's an outlet that has like a number of shows, we can create an organizational ID so that they get assigned to you. And identified.
Great.
I see about independently produced shows. Yes, we are definitely interested in independently produced shows. Email me, like I said, with a secure RSS feed and some episodes that you want me to listen to, and we love to have those included as well.
Can you give some examples of what independently produced podcasts have performed best on NPR One and why? Is there some off the top of your head that you would like to give as examples?
So we kind of were an early adopter of Making Gay History before Pineapple Street kind of made them more prominent. I'd heard about the show. We put an episode into NPR One. It was in NPR One. We promoted an episode that I think was the Dear Abby episode, talking about how it was an interview with Dear Abby talking about how she'd gotten all these letters over the years about people concerned that their, relative was gay or how to handle it. And she was just like a really staunch advocate for the gay community through her column. And it just did remarkably well. Our listeners loved it. I can't remember exactly how many listens it got, but very quickly we were one of their largest platforms. We've also had a huge amount of success with 20,000 Hertz. If anybody hasn't listened to that show, you should definitely listen to it. Example of an independently produced show that is really well done, super thoughtful about the way that they put together their content and put their shows together. It's just they're Dallas is like super smart about it. So I would definitely recommend listening to that show for a great example of the kind of content that works really well. And when Dallas and I first started talking, it was like this great melding of the minds where like what we were saying about the importance of the first 5 minutes and the length and the titles and all of those things, being able to provide the data to show that that works really kind of jived with the way that he was putting his shows together. And so we had a huge amount of success with that show. I think the first one that we featured was called The Voice of Siri, and it just got a ton of listens. The listeners who got it loved it. And, we continue to see just a ton of listens for that show on the app.
And so when you say you continue to see a ton of listens, is there sort of staying power too, that you've seen that like independent or station-based produced shows that you've seen has like a longer tail of listeners than normally?
That's sort of the benefit of our affiliation of our algorithm. So when we promote an episode, like we promoted the Voice of Siri episode of 20,000 Hertz, and it went out to probably about, I don't know, it probably got over 100,000 listens within about a week or so. And some percent, I don't have it in front of me, some percent of those listeners listened through to enough of it or liked or shared it in some way that our algorithm deemed that they had a positive listening experience. And so then when the next episode of 20,000 Hertz came out, if they listened, they would get for long enough to NPR One, they would get that episode. And then you continue to see that tail as long as the listeners are having a positive experience with the show.
That's very cool. Staying power. Yeah.
What we figured out is that our algorithms can generally judge what people are interested in listening to and are going to listen to better than people can figure it out for themselves. So they're more likely to listen to more of something that we feed them or that our algorithm feeds them than they are to something they've subscribed to. And I think that's generally true across a lot of different like digital media, that people are, that algorithms are better judges than people are of themselves. Somebody just asked if we require exclusive distribution. We don't. We're not a platform just like Apple Podcasts or any other podcatcher, and so we don't require exclusive distribution. We're not a distributor in the way that like PRX or even NPR One's programming division is.
Cool. And so that would mean that the answer to Todd Melby's question as well is that shows produced by community radio stations not part of NPR, would those be included to listeners in the same geography?
No.
Okay.
That's just for stuff member stations.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Let's move on to some more questions. Sorry, this is like rapid fire.
No problem. I love it.
So does NPR One distinguish between produced pieces and interview format podcasts in terms of what you'll consider promoting in your promotion strategies?
We're open to either format as long as it's well done and we think that it is a good example of your show's content and that it adheres to the sort of promotion criteria we talked about. We've seen interview shows do really well. We've seen highly produced content do really well. As long as it's good content, we'll consider it.
Cool. I think that's really encouraging to the producers we have on this call, whose content ranges really widely. And it's a great, vast wealth of knowledge and story here. So that sounds encouraging to me. But there's also questions here about local versus global content of interest. So, for example, Kathy says, I cover international contemporary art, film, and architecture. So she's asking, are both local and global content of interest? And then Sharon asks, can a local member station tag or star a local independent podcast that features stories that are regionally of interest? My show has a general interest topic, but the guests are all local and maybe of great interest to people in this city and region.
So I'll take the second question first. They can't. They can only feature for their local audience content that they're putting in through our Station Connect system. So they don't have access to stuff that we've added separately through our podcast plucker, is what we call it. And the first question, we as long as content is of national interest, generally, we feel comfortable featuring it. If it's something hyper local that is not going to appeal to the majority of our audience, then it's not going to make sense for promotion. But that may be one specific, if one episode is more local, that just may not be the right episode to feature, and maybe we need to look at a different episode that takes a more like national or global view.
Cool. And I think this is a similar question to one that you answered earlier, but let's just dive into it a little bit deeper. With seasons of a show, you said like maybe let's start off with the first episode and launch that way. Mm-hmm. But for example, Juliet asks, if you have a 16 episode season coming out over say winter or spring, what might the timeline for inclusion be? And would you air all of the episodes, or are you looking for the 16 episodes at once? What's the sort of staggering of full seasons?
I hope this answers the question. So I think one is like the content being on NPR One. Anytime we take a show, we're taking all of its content. All of the episodes that are on your RSS feed will show up in NPR One. And we don't mess with like the timing of that or anything like that. What works best with our algorithm are shows that are put out on a regular basis, weekly or bi-weekly or something like that. If it's a show that gets put out all at once, so you put 8 episodes on your RSS feed at once, it's going to mess with our algorithms a little bit, which isn't to say that we won't promote it. It just means that listeners might not necessarily get it in the right order. But the other is if a show is on a long hiatus. So if it's 3 months until your next episode comes out, we'll wait until a little bit closer to when that episode, until when you're in production again to promote the content. Because the way the algorithm works is that it's kind of looking for content to feed from the last like 3 or 4 weeks. And if you get much beyond that and there's not new content, you're going to kind of lose those opportunities a little bit. It looks like there's a question about sharing my email address. It was on that last slide. Can we pull that back up so people can see it, or else I can just tell everyone my email? Oh, there it is. Somebody just wrote it in the comments.
Yeah,
that's my email.
Right, and we'll send out your email address and the recording video after this.
Fantastic.
Cool. So you talked about just the as long as you feel like it's good content, you're going to be excited to take it. But this person is asking, are there any content genres or themes that you're particularly excited about and or that you'd like to see more of?
That's a good question. We've seen so many different things do really well. There are, obviously we've had a lot of luck with like storytelling, serialized podcasts. Things like Dirty John did really well just because of the stickiness of those kinds of shows. So we always love something like that. There's definitely a sort of like news and political awareness that's happening right now. So those kinds of things are definitely resonating with listeners. But then there are like tech shows and all kinds of different things that do really well. We've had a number of like outdoorsy kind of shows that have resonated, environmental shows. So it really has more to do with the quality of the show and the interest of the show than like a specific topic.
Great. Let's see. So this person is asking a little bit more about technical stuff. So I think we have time for about 2 or 3 more questions. So I'll ask this one, and then we'll do a last call for any more questions you want to ask. Just throw them in the chat box. So thank you. So on the East RSS feed, mine is the Libsyn, and I'm not familiar with the enclosure you were talking about. So could you share some more specifics, please? And thank you.
Libsyn, it's really easy. If you call them and you say, I need my podcast, my RSS feed to be secure, and I need my audio enclosure to be secure, they are really good about just doing that for you. And we'll get it in shape. And, you know, when you send it to me, if I'll test it as well to make sure it works. Most podcast hosting companies know how to make their podcasts secure. I think SoundCloud is the only one that like absolutely doesn't work. So if you're hosted on SoundCloud, I think right now there's like absolutely nothing we can do about it, unfortunately. But most other hosts know how to make their RSS feed secure. And it's just a good thing to have and to do, because eventually Apple is going to move over to requiring everything being secure. The reason that we require that our RSS feeds be secure is because Apple has sort of dangled this out there as eventually they will only allow apps in the App Store that have nothing but secure links. And so we've gone through a really long, like 1.5-year process of getting every link on NPR One and basically throughout the NPR digital portfolio to be secure. And at this point, like our systems literally will not allow us to add anything that isn't secure. Yes, and secure is HTTPS, both in terms of the RSS feed and then, like I said, the audio enclosure. I'll just reiterate, the way to test that is to just put your RSS feed into a browser. You'll see this long page of code come up. If you hit Control F and start typing an enclosure, it'll pop up with most likely your audio enclosure. And you'll want to look for the HTTPS prefix in that as well. So
awesome.
Yeah,
that's super helpful. Okay, cool. I'm going to ask one question that might take a little explaining, because I know that it can be a little confusing, but it's about music licensing.
Yes.
So can we talk about music rights and licensing? Do indie podcasters need to prove that they've cleared the rights before NPR One would feature our work?
We have never asked anyone to prove it. I'm going to assume that you've cleared it. You take on the legal liability for it no matter what. So even if it's on our platform, we don't have legal liability for your music choices. That said, please don't try to put unlicensed music on our platform. We don't want to, have that fight. So.
Right. And I'll also do a quick shout out that if you go on to AIR's website, airmedia.org, and you search music licensing woes, we have a whole music licensing guide that will walk you through step by step what kind of licenses you need for each type of music you're sourcing. So if you have any questions, you might want to go there first. And then there's a ton of questions about fair use also on the AIR Daily. It's a constant question that always comes up. So it's a little confusing, this sort of space between podcasting and music and rights. But yeah, like Emily said, always make sure that you are clearing your music. You never want to be caught in a sort of fair use argument where you don't sort of have the legal legs to stand on. So highly recommended.
You don't even want to get close to it, because the legal battle is more than you, like even if you win that legal battle, you don't want to be in it.
Exactly. Yeah. I was just talking to a lawyer who said the only legal standing you have claiming fair use is the right to hire a lawyer. So yeah, don't mess with it. It's serious stuff. Okay, great. Let's see if there are any other questions before we sort of sign off. But yes, we have one more. which podcasts that you've included on your app have actually gotten syndicated afterwards?
That's a good question. I don't know. We are not a gateway to being distributed by NPR. That's not our intention, or like NPR is not using us as a sort of testing ground for what they distribute. We're like a totally separate entity. So I wouldn't use NPR One as your gateway to distribution. I think is to approach potential distributors, including, the NPR Story Lab is taking applications right now for their big workshop. You can always submit stuff to the Story Lab at NPR, and that's definitely a better way to get distribution and editorial support from NPR than through NPR One. I do feel bad for my inbox too, but somebody just commented, I feel bad for your inbox. I am happy to hear from all of you. So even if it takes me a while to respond, just know that this is what I'm here for. This is my job. I love hearing from podcasters and listening to podcasts that I've never heard of. So especially after today, it may take me a little while to get back to you, but I will.
Well, I think that's a really good note to end on. But Emily, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave with these folks before we sign off?
I just want to be generally really encouraging. I think the podcast space is such an interesting and exciting and dynamic space to be in right now. I think we are just beginning to see the potential of this medium, and there are going to be a ton of changes. So I'm very excited to see what you guys are all working on.
Me too. And again, if you have any questions about what we talked about today, you can email Emily directly. Her email is on the slides, and I'll send those out along with this recording afterwards. And yeah, send an email to me, to Emily, ask away, and we're always here for you guys, and we love what you do. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.